There's one specific word the defense used, one clinical term. That changed everything I thought I knew about this case. It was just a single word that they used to describe her state of mind that changed my entire professional perspective on this case. I'm going to show you exactly what that was and why the truth is nothing like what we have been told. Today, I'm taking you behind the headlines. We aren't just talking about the crime. You likely already know the crime. But we're going to talk about the clinical collision behind a human mind and an impossible amount of pressure. Is she a monster? Is she a cold killer? Or did she suffer from a mental illness? If we get that answer wrong, we're missing the most important lesson there is about the hidden signs of a total break. Look at these two faces right here. They're the same woman in the same legal battle, but they represent two completely different psychological worlds. For weeks, the world watched Lindsay Clancy's blank, unblinking stare and called her cold. They said that she was faking it, but then she started to cry. And suddenly, the narrative shifted again. As a clinician, I have to tell you, both of these reactions are symptoms of the same catastrophic mental fracture. That initial dead look wasn't a choice. It was a biological shield. And those tears, that's what happens when the self finally starts to wake up inside a reality it just can't survive. As a licensed professional counselor, when I look at the timeline leading up to that night, I don't just see a tragic news story. I see a terrifying collision. It's a textbook example of over-medication-induced delirium, crashing headfirst into postpartum psychosis. It's like two storms hitting at once. Today, we're going to peel back what I call the tragedy mask and see exactly where the clinical reality starts to slip through the cracks of the legal arguments. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand the psychological red flags of the total break point. These are the subtle, quiet indicators that even a calculated mind can't hide. Skills that, frankly, you might end up using to spot a crisis in your own life and in your own family before things reach a point of no return. I'm John Cordray. I've been a licensed professional counselor since 2007. Now, I have to be clear here. Everything that I'm saying here is my professional speculation. It's based on the public records and the behaviors that I'm observing. I also want to mention that as the date of this video, this case is currently in legal proceedings, so the outcome of the trial is still to be determined. This isn't a formal diagnosis of anyone involved in this case, but we do need to look at the facts. So let's dive into the Lindsay Clancy's clinical file. I've had so many requests to do a clinical breakdown on this particular case. And as I looked into it, I can see why. There are so many psychological layers and twists and turns in this case, and I totally agree that it deserves a full, deep dive clinical breakdown. When I first reviewed this case, it was early in the morning. I didn't really see a criminal strategy. I saw a textbook case of a mind that had gone completely offline and was only just beginning to reboot. You may look at that photo of Lindsay Clancy in her hospital bed and see one of two things. You'll see someone who's faking it to stay out of prison, or you can see a woman paralyzed by a grief we cannot even imagine. But as a clinician, when I look at that blank stare, I'm seeing something else entirely. I'm seeing an example of what we call affective flattening. And let me tell you, that isn't something you just turn on for the cameras. It's a specific chilling indicator that a human mind hasn't just been stressed, it's been completely shattered. Bring up graphic 15 here. With affective flattening, there is a trauma threshold. And beneath the surface, there is mounting psychological pressure. And it's building and building. Then it reaches an emotional vacuity, which is the state of emptiness and numbness. It's not really deception, but it's more of a biological shield. Faking requires overacting, but flattening is the mind pulling the emergency brake to survive reality. Today, we're going to look at the Lindsay Clancy case through a clinical lens to uncover those deep psychological layers that I really honestly think almost everyone is missing right now. The stakes here are massive. There's this huge, angry divide in how the public sees this. People are asking, was this a cold-blooded, timed-out calculation, or was it a total mental fracture where the self wasn't even in the room anymore? If we get that answer wrong, we're not just misjudging a trial, we're missing the most important lesson there is about what happens to the human mind when it's under that impossible amount of pressure. But first, we need to talk about that look on her face. I know it's heavy. I know it's hard to even watch if you know about this case. But let's just take a second here, because we have to look at why this actually matters for you and for me. Let's look at the months leading up to that night in January. When I was reviewing the timeline, one thing that kept jumping out at me was Lindsay wasn't just stressed. She wasn't just a tired mom having a rough patch. She was seeking help constantly. She was checking herself into hospitals. She was talking to doctors. She was vocalizing that something was fundamentally wrong with her. But here's where it gets a little complicated. And honestly, as a clinician, this is the part that makes me lean into this case. She was taking a cocktail of medications. We're talking about a list that includes benzos, antidepressants, and sleep aids. Sometimes even changed or adjusted multiple times in a single week. It doesn't go well. Clinically, we have to ask a very uncomfortable question here. Was she actually being treated? Or was her brain being chemically overwhelmed? Think about the chemistry for a second. If you have a brain that is already struggling with postpartum mood disorder, where the neurochemicals are already misfiring, and then you introduce a rotating door of heavy psychotropic drugs, you aren't just adjusting a mood. You're potentially creating a state of toxic delirium. Pull up graphic 4 here. On one side, it could be the postpartum psychosis, which is a combination of misfiring of neurochemicals and of biological vulnerability. On the other side, it could have been a chemical overwhelm and shock to her system from taking a cocktail of drugs, rotating in that single week. I've seen cases where the side effects of the cure, the medications, actually mimic the symptoms of the disease. It's like trying to put out a fire with a substance you're not entirely sure isn't actually gasoline. And when I look at the sheer volume of her prescriptions, I actually had to stop for a second because it didn't make clinical sense. It felt like a desperate attempt to sedate a problem that needed a much deeper, more stable level of intervention. Now, I want to pause here. I'm not pointing fingers at the doctors. I'm not pointing fingers at the pharmaceutical companies or medications. I'm not saying that she not take antidepressants. That's not what I'm saying. But you have to step back and look at the context here. We have to really question this from hindsight. And that's the key. All this is hindsight. But I think there's an important lesson here when it comes to treating a diagnosis with multiple types of medication. But why didn't anyone see this coming in Lindsay? How could a husband, a family, or a community miss this? Within the mental health field, we actually see this phenomenon often, and it's something that I call the good mother archetype. It's a form of high-functioning disassociation. Lindsay was a nurse, She was a mother who, by all public accounts, was doing everything right. She was organized, she was present, she was performing perfection. Lindsay was making snacks for her kids. She was scheduling play dates, while her internal fracture, her actual self, was drifting further and further away. Typically, when we see a high-functioning disassociation, the better the performance of perfection is, the more dangerous of the internal fracture. But here's the clinical secret here. Bring up graphic 6 here. I want to explain this a little further. When you're in that good mother mode, you aren't just hiding your pain from others. You're often hiding it from yourself as well. You're operating on a script. You're checking the boxes. You're making the snacks. You're scheduling the play dates. But internally, the self, the actual person, is drifting further away from the wheel. It's a textbook case of a mind fracturing under the weight of an identity that it can no longer sustain. Her husband reportedly said that he saw glimmerings of her old self, which tells me that the real Lindsay was already slipping behind the mask. Dealing with these type of cases, especially when it involves children, I know it's incredibly taxing on the nervous system. So I want you to really pause if you need to. But if you want to keep going, let's do it. Hey friends, if you're finding this kind of professional deep dive perspective helpful in navigating these complex stories, go ahead and karate chop that subscribe button. While the rest of the world is focused on the perfection of her social media photos or the horror of the charges, this clinical file, the real messy hidden history, shows a very different story happening inside her brain. It shows a mind that was slowly being erased by a combination of biological vulnerability and a medical intervention that might have been the final weight that broke that scale. Most people will see a woman who made a choice. But when I look at this developmental blueprint, I'm seeing a woman who was slowly losing the ability to choose. But wait, if she was performing perfection so well, how do we explain the specific calculated actions the prosecution says that she took that night? That's where the mask gets even more complicated. We have to look at the difference between planning and pacing. Most people assume that if there's a timeline, there's a motive. But in a clinical state of psychosis, planning doesn't look like a criminal conspiracy. It looks like a compulsion. It's a lot like a dream, where you're following a logic that makes perfect sense while you're asleep, but it's completely insane when you wake up. Have you had dreams like that? I have. But did she ever really wake up? That's what we're going to look at next when we dive into the actual behavioral breakdown of the night itself. Remember that one word I mentioned at the very beginning of this video? The one that changed my entire professional perspective on this case? In the defense's opening statement, they used the word involuntary. Pull up graphic 11 here. Now, in a courtroom, that's a legal strategy. It's a crime. It seems rational. But in my office, clinically, that word is massive. It's the difference between a crime and a medical catastrophe. When we talk about postpartum psychosis, we're talking about a total break from reality. If the brain is in the state of true psychosis, the self, the person you know as Lindsay, isn't the one driving the car anymore. I like to think of the human brain like a high-powered computer. Most of the time, the software is running smooth, but in psychosis, it's like a corrupted program has taken over the entire operating system. The hardware is still there. The body is moving. The user might even look like they're performing tasks, but the logic is completely broken. It's a glitch on a life-altering scale. When I heard the word involuntary, it clicked for me because it describes the terrifying loss of agency that happens when the neurochemistry of the brain simply stops cooperating with the person's actual character. And this leads us to what everyone is talking about, her behavior in court. I spent thousands of hours sitting across from people in deep psychological distress. And when I look at the footage of Lindsay, she looks gone. There's no other way to put it. I see the comments that people say that she's faking it. They say that she's acting numb to get sympathy. But what if there's a different part of the story here we're not quite understanding? I don't know. This is my assumption, my speculation here. But let me tell you something from my years of clinical experience. Faking usually looks like more emotion, not less. When someone is trying to manipulate you into believing they are distressed, they tend to overact. They sob, they wail, they try to show you their pain. But what I see with Lindsay is a total emotional vacuity. This is what a human mind looks like when it's still trying to process a reality it literally can't survive. It's called a dissociative amnesia or depersonalization. Her brain has pulled the emergency brake. It has shut down the emotional centers because if she were to actually feel the weight of what happened in that basement, the sheer psychic pain would likely be fatal. This isn't a mask of deception. It's a biological shield, in my mind. It's the mind's last-ditch effort to keep the body alive by disconnecting from the soul. But we have to address the why of the mask. We talked earlier about the good mother archetype. Remember that? But I want to go deeper into a concept called compulsive compliance. Lindsay was a nurse. She was trained. She was professionally conditioned to keep it all together in a state of crisis. In the medical field, you learn to put on a professional mask no matter how much chaos is happening around you. I was never a nurse. My mom was. I've had plenty of clients who were nurses. And this is what they tell me. You have to compartmentalize your personal life, any conflict you've had with other staff members, and focus specifically on the patient in crisis. For years, she wore a mask of wellness. She was the one that people leaned on. She was the one who had the answers. But the problem of wearing a mask of wellness for that long is that when it finally cracks, the results aren't just messy. They're catastrophic. Because she was so good at hiding scary thoughts, the people around her didn't see the pressure building. Clinically, this is why we have to look past the headlines and see the pathology. We aren't looking at a bad person who suddenly did a bad thing. Let's look at graphic 8 here. We're looking at a highly functioning system that reached a total mechanical failure. Imagine looking at a really nice car, really nice. It looks new, it looks shiny, and so you buy it thinking it would be perfect. But then after a few days, you notice something is really wrong under the hood. The battery, the oil pressure, and the temperature lights are all going off. Uh-oh. Just because the car looks new doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy. That's exactly what I think is happening here. A high-functioning person doesn't equal a healthy person. For a high-functioning person, the danger zone is when energy is spent entirely on the performance of wellness. And that leaves zero battery reserve for when a biological crisis hits. Lindsay's compulsive compliance was at a 99%. She wore the professional mask of wellness with her training as a nurse, hiding her scary thoughts and checking the boxes, but her crisis reserve was at a 1%. Which left zero reserve for postpartum complications or for a chemical imbalance. When that mask of compliance shattered, what poured out wasn't malice. It was the raw, unfiltered symptoms of a brain that had been pushed into a psychotic break by a combination of biological vulnerability and, quite possibly, that chemical cocktail of medications that I discussed earlier. Now I know what you're probably thinking. I'm sure it'll probably pop up in the comments. It's the what about? Because the prosecution has a very different story. They pointed to her phone, her GPS, her timing. They say that she was calculating. And on the surface, they're right. Those actions look like a plan. In a moment, I'm going to show you a specific piece of evidence brought forward by the prosecution that seems to be completely contradict everything I just said about her being gone or being in the psychotic state. It looks like the ultimate smoking gun of her guilt. But I'm going to explain why, through a clinical lens, that exact piece of evidence actually confirms the presence of psychosis rather than disproving it. It's a part of the case that most true crime narrators miss because they don't understand the difference between executive function and moral intent. You can have a plan in a dream. You can follow logic in a nightmare. But that doesn't mean the person you are when you're awake is the one who made the choices in the dream. This is the exact point where the courtroom and mental health go to battle. This is the intersection of law and psychology that makes this case so haunting and, frankly, so frustrating for someone in my position to watch. I'm not a lawyer, but the lawyers aren't a therapist either. Maybe the two should get together. Wouldn't that be a something? We're essentially trying to apply rational legal standards, rules written for people who are awake, aware, and in control, to an irrational clinical event. The law looks for a guilty mind. It looks for intent, for planning, for a choice. But as a clinician, I have to ask, can a mind be guilty if it isn't even present? This brings us back to that heavy, heavy word, involuntary. In the legal world, involuntary usually refers to a physical reflex or an accident. But in the world of psychology and mental health, especially when we're talking about a psychotic break, the term involuntary takes on a much darker, much more profound meaning. It's a state where your executive functions, the very parts of your brain that weighs consequences and says no, have been completely bypassed. Pull up graphic 10. There are really only two options when it comes to involuntary action. Either it's a physical reflex or an accident, or it's a total bypass of executive function. It's the difference between a calculated crime and a medical catastrophe. Think of it like this. Your brain has an override switch. In moments of extreme trauma, high-level delirium, or acute psychosis, that switch can be flipped. Suddenly, your body is moving, your mouth is speaking, and you're performing tasks that look intentional to the outside observer, but your actual self, internal self, is essentially a passenger in a car with no brakes. The body is moving, but the logic is broken. The person you know is no longer really driving the car. It's what we call command hallucinations or compulsive ideation. When the defense uses the word involuntary, they're suggesting that Lindsay wasn't choosing her actions. She was responding to a reality that only she could see. And this is where the rational world gets it wrong. We look at her actions and say, she must have known what she was doing because she was so organized. But as a therapist, I know that you can be highly organized and still be completely detached from reality. I've talked with clients who were in the middle of a manic or psychotic episode who could navigate a city, use a phone, and hold a conversation. Yet they believed that they were on a mission from God or that their family had been replaced by imposters. The doing is intact, but the why is broken. And that brings us to the smoking gun. The prosecution points to a very specific moment. Lindsay used her GPS on her phone to look up how long it would take her husband to get home. To a prosecutor, that's a rational calculation of time. It's evidence of a plan. They say, look, she was checking the clock. She was looking at GPS. She was waiting for her window. But here's where we have to look at the truth behind the pathology. It's hidden in the pathology. When I look at the same evidence through a clinical lens, I don't see a killer checking a watch or GPS. I see a mind in the middle of a prodromal phase of a total break. In a state of psychosis, the brain often fixates on anchors, the small repetitive tasks or calculations that give a false sense of order to an internal chaos. The mind hyperfocuses on the minute, the specific details, because it can no longer process reality. Think about a nightmare. You're in a dream and you're performing a task. Maybe you're trying to find a specific room or dial a phone number or go outside and walk around and look for someone. Within the logic of the dream, that action is rational. But when you wake up, you realize the entire premise was insane. What did I just think about? What did I just dream about? For Lindsay, looking up at that time might not have been a calculation for a crime. It could have been a desperate, obsessive attempt to ground herself in a reality that was rapidly dissolving. It's called hyperreflexivity. Bring up graphic 19. The mind becomes hyper-focused on the minute details because it can no longer process the big picture. A false sense of order is happening while the reality is dissolving at the same time. Until we understand the fractured mind doesn't always look like a screaming, chaotic mess, that it can look like a quiet, calculated nurse checking GPS, we're just guessing. We're trying to find a guilty mind in place where the mind itself already left the building. So let's look closer at the evidence and ask the hard question. Are we seeing a plan, or are we seeing the final mechanical movements of the brain that had already lost its self? Because if the choice was truly involuntary, then the justice we're looking for might not be found in a prison cell, but in understanding how we let a human mind get this far into the dark in the first place. To truly understand the weight of the Lindsay Clancy case, we have to move past the courtroom and look at the broader, more sobering reality of how we handle mental health in our society. It's about taking the tragedy of this case and turning it into a tool for understanding the human condition. I want to take a step back here for a moment. I want to pull away from the legal arguments and the prosecution's timeline and the media headlines, because the macro lesson here, the thing that really stays with me as a clinician when I turn off the camera and I go back to my practice, it isn't just about one high-profile case. It's a stark, painful reminder that mental health isn't always just a feeling. We've been conditioned to think of mental illness as a mood, being sad or stressed or angry. But as a licensed professional counselor, I'm here to tell you that sometimes mental health is a biological system, a physical organ that has simply reached its absolute mechanical limit. There is a powerful, powerful connection between the mind and body. You can't have one without the other. We have this tendency in our culture to treat the mind as something completely separate from the body, something ethereal, something apart, other than, that we can just will into submission with enough grit or positive thinking. But your brain is an organ, just like your heart or your lungs. And just like any other organ, it can suffer from a total systemic failure. When the heart stops, we call it a heart attack. When the brain's ability to process reality stops, we call it psychosis. But for some reason, we treat the latter as moral failing rather than a medical catastrophe. Why is that? Mental health is not just a feeling or a mood. It's a biological system. The mind and the body are one, and they are connected. When I look at this case, I see a warning. I see a flashing red light of our entire mental health infrastructure. We have to start looking at the clinical why, the underlying neurobiology, the dangerous medical interactions, and the silent fractures that happen in the mind. if we ever hope to prevent the what. If we only focus on the tragedy after it happens, we're just sweeping up the glass after the window has already shattered. We have to look at the structural integrity of the house before the storm hits. Honestly, I was sitting here reviewing the clinical files for this video. I kept thinking about how many people are watching this right now while wearing their own version of a good mother or a good dad or a good professional mask. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's someone who's sitting in a room with you and they're checking all the boxes. They're showing up for work. They're smiling for the family photos and posting the perfect updates. But internally, the system is redlining. The gauges are all in the red zone and they're running on fumes. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this clinical deep dive, it's that high functioning doesn't mean healthy. Not always. In fact, in my experience, the people who look the most together are often the ones who are the closest to a total catastrophic break. Why? Because they've used every single ounce of their psychic energy just to maintain the appearance of stability. They have spent their entire battery on the performance of wellness, leaving them with absolutely no reserve when a real crisis, like postpartum complications or a chemical imbalance, actually hits. Whew. Wow. I know this case is incredibly polarizing. I don't know what side you're on. You can tell me in the comments. You can tell me if I'm completely off base. And I see this polarization in the comments every day. Not just this video, but other videos. And that's okay. You have your opinions. I have mine. I could be wrong. You could be wrong. But I hear the pain in your voices in the comments. There's a lot of righteous anger out there, and I get that. There's a lot of grief in the lives lost. But as we look at this through the lens of psychology and mental health, we have to ask ourselves, are we looking for justice or are we looking for an explanation? Because sometimes the explanation is so terrifyingly clinical that it challenges our very idea of what justice even looks like. If we accept that a brain can break, truly, fundamentally break, then we have to accept that the person that we are judging might not have been there when the event happened. And that is a terrifying thought for a society that relies on the idea of free will and personal responsibility. To be sure, to be clear, Lindsay has to own up her actions. I'm not saying that she should get off scot-free. I'm saying that she might need to get some real clinical help. If you're interested in seeing more of how this clinical pattern of masking and internal fracture compares to other high-profile cases, although through a very different, perhaps more calculated psychological angle, you should definitely watch my next clinical breakdown right here. Do you think our legal system is even capable of judging a person whose self was no longer at the wheel? Can a system built on rational rules and intent ever truly find justice for an irrational clinical event that happened in a fog of psychosis? That is something to think about.